This lecture will focus on what the South was like during the antebellum time. Antebellum meaning before the war, before the Civil War. All right, the Southern economy was just always all about farming. And so it's whatever could grow the best in your area. That's what you grew, and you grew as much of it as you can so that you could sell it and make a whole lot of money. And so it was kind of all about these cash crops. Remember, we've learned that word before, okay? Cash crops are crops that you're growing to make money. And so there were four major cash crops depending on the part of the South that you lived in. If you were in the northern states of the South, like Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, tobacco was kind of the main cash crop, which we talked about that a lot with the colonies as well. The rice was a major cash crop in like South Carolina and Georgia, but really close to the coast where there was underwater, because you'd create these rice paddies that you'd grow your rice on. Sugarcane was grown in Louisiana and in eastern Texas. Again, kind of these lower, warm, tropical kinds of areas with lots of water coming in. And then cotton. Cotton was kind of the king. Cotton was the biggest one of them all. It was grown in this wide belt from South Carolina, inland South Carolina, all the way over to Texas. And it was by far and away the biggest and most important crop in the South, bar none. A New England guy by the name of Eli Whitney came down and visited some areas in the South. And when he was down there, he noticed all of these people that were removing the cotton seeds, because you had to get the seeds out before you could make cloth out of it. They were removing the cotton seeds from these bowls by hand, which was super, super tedious. It took about an entire day just to take the seeds out of 1 pound of lint. So it was kind of crazy how long this was taking. And so he built this machine. He built this machine right here, the cotton gin. And the cotton gin, you could just kind of run it through. It took him about 10 days to invent it, and it was this machine that just quickly combed through and removed all the seeds from the cotton bolls. So it's essentially like little razors that would cut the threads and take the seeds out. And the seeds would fall, and the actual cotton would come right through. And so because of this cotton gin, and as well as the textile mills that were growing in the northern part of America, it just meant that there was a lot more demand for cotton. And so this demand for cotton went from 6,000 bales. There was 6,000 bales demanded in 1792, and just 9 years later, in 1801, every single year, 100,000 bales of cotton were produced and sold. So as cotton started to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, by the late 1840s, people from the South were producing over 2 million bales of cotton every single year. And by 1860, by the wartime, it was up to almost 4 million bales. So that would be about $192 million in money that they got for exporting this cotton, and that was over half of all the exports, the value of all the exports that the U.S. was sending out. And so Southerners began to say cotton was king. And of course, with cotton growing, you also needed somebody to pick the cotton and to process the cotton and do all those kinds of things. And in the South, that meant we needed more plantations, more of these huge farms. And these huge farms had workers on them that were slaves. So slave labor was what was needed, and it started to increase very, very quickly. However, it had already been made illegal in America to import any slaves from a foreign country, from another country, and so they had to find their slaves in a different way. So slave owners started to encourage a high birth rate amongst their slaves. So try to get their slaves to have children, because as soon as they had children, then those children would become their slaves as well. And so they would have more slaves, and they could either use those slaves to work for them or sell those slaves for a whole lot of money. And so from 1820 to 1850, the number of people that were born into slavery went from 1.5 million in 1820, so we can see right here 1.5 million, to 1850 when it got up over 3 million, almost up to 4 million people that were born into slavery. While there wasn't much industry in the South, there was some to be sure. It just wasn't the focus. In the South, there was a very slow growth, but still some growth of industry. Most of the South was rural. It didn't have a whole lot of really big cities. There were three big cities in the South, really, if you counted them. Those were Baltimore, which is in Maryland, Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, which is in Louisiana. So those were really the only big three in the South. And so the South had some industry, but mostly relied on importing goods from either the North or from other countries. Only about 16% of the U.S. manufacturing was in the South, which meant that 84% was up north. So quite a bit more in the North. And the main focus, if it was an industry, was of course agriculture, farming. Whatever they could farm is what they made their money off of. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint 1. So there were, I would say, five major social classes in the southern part of America at this time. And at the very top, the most powerful were the plantation owners. And the plantation owners were also a very, very small group of people. So a plantation is this giant farm where you'd have many, many slaves there to help you out. And so just to kind of understand how few people there actually were that were in plantations, only about 6% of the total people in the South owned any slaves at all. And only about 0.6% of those 6%, right, so a very small amount, were planters and owned 20 or more slaves. So 0.6% of 6% were these plantation owners. These people were talking about a tiny, tiny little fraction. But of course, they were the rich ones, and so they dominated the economy and the political system and all that kind of stuff. The majority, the biggest group, was the yeoman farmer. Yeoman farmer is just kind of a different name, a different way of saying just a person who owns a small farm. So they're making enough for themselves and to make some money off of the cash crops that they're growing as well. Again, this is the largest group of people. There was a rather small urban class. These people were lawyers, doctors, merchants living inside of the cities, these three big cities or the small cities. Most of them, everything was so tied to farming, most of them still had small farms that they went home to at the end of the day. And then we get down into kind of the lower class groups, the white rural poor, the people that lived kind of out in the middle of nowhere. They owned land, but that land just wasn't very good for farming, so they did subsistence farming, and so they made just enough to survive and never could really make much money off of their crops. And then, of course, at the bottom was African Americans. Freedmen were a little bit above the slaves, but definitely all of them were at the bottom. There were about 3.6 million African Americans in the South at this time, which was over a third of the population. About 37% of the total population was African Americans, and many of them were enslaved African Americans. And so just a little bit about these slaves. Most of the slaves worked on farms. There were some that worked in factories or in as skilled workers, in people's houses as house servants. There were a couple, but the vast majority were working out on the farms in the fields. And so the states kind of all had their own individual slave codes, and some of the main things that these slave codes showed was just kind of restrictions on what slaves were allowed to do. And so they weren't allowed to own their own land. They weren't allowed to leave the slaveholder's land without permission. They were not allowed to bring a lawsuit or sign a contract or do anything like that. They weren't allowed to own a gun. They weren't allowed to testify in court against a white person, and they weren't really allowed in many states to learn to read or write, even though many did go on to do that anyways. And so kind of the overarching theme of this is that the slaves were seen as property, not as people. They were seen as something you owned and not as a person who lived with you. So it was really a bad relationship, and they were really restricted in what they were able to do. There were two major systems of work when it came to slavery. You could be on a farm that used the task system or a farm that used the gang system. And it was definitely better to be on a task system farm. These were mostly on farms that were a little bit smaller and really small plantations where there weren't quite so many slaves on them. And basically, what it was you had a certain amount of jobs or chores that you had to get done every day, and then the rest of the day was yours to do with whatever you wanted. So if you got out and you got your work done, then you could go and you could go into your own garden and grow some stuff to sell, or you could make items to sell. You could just continue to do something else with your life. And so that allowed them to earn some money or make their lives better in some way, learn to read, learn to dance, learn to play music, whatever it was. That was the task system. The other system was the gang system. This was used mostly on large plantations, and what happened is one person would be put in charge, and they were called a driver, and they were usually chosen from the slaves, and because they were loyal to the slaveholder. And so they were chosen, and what they did is they made sure that the group of people that was underneath them worked and would work continuously the entire day. And so it didn't matter if you got your tasks done, you would just move on to the next task and continue to work tirelessly the entire day. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 2. All right, other African Americans other than just your kind of typical adult male slave, there were slave women, of course, and the women did kind of different work generally. Oftentimes they would work in the fields right alongside the men, or sometimes they were up in the house and they worked as nannies, maids, cooks, where they would cook food for everybody, take care of the children of the plantation owner, clean up after them, do the household duties, that kind of stuff. The other thing they might do is they might be put in charge of almost like a nursery where they would take care of all the other slave children while the other women would work. And so the slave children, they were treated a little bit differently. They were allowed to play, do their own thing, learn all that kind of stuff. They were allowed to do that stuff until they were old enough to get their chores. And then, of course, as soon as they were old enough, they would start to have these chores that they were responsible for every single day. They were not allowed to get an education, but oftentimes, again, they would kind of go against the rules and go out and learn to read and write on their own. The other kind of person, other kind of African American that was around in the South were free African Americans. And so a lot of them, they earned their freedom through a couple of different things. Maybe number one, they earned it by fighting in the Revolution and they were let free for doing that. Or they earned it because they were like the half-white children of slaveholders, because the slave man and the slave woman and the master white man had a kid, and they kind of let them go because it was their kid. Or the other option is they made enough money throughout being their task time or whatever to buy their own freedom. In some cities, these free African Americans became successful, and successful enough even to buy their own slaves to have them. And so that was kind of a little bit of a weird, different dynamic. But no matter what, the African American people, free or not, faced discrimination wherever they were. The things they were allowed to do was to organize their own churches, publish newspapers, earn money from their jobs, but that was kind of basically it. You were still seen as less than everyone else. So kind of the way that they dealt with slavery on a daily basis, they would write songs and sing them and just try and make it through with their own little culture of the written word and religion and all those kinds of things. And so songs were a very important part of this. But some of the other things that they did were a little bit more subversive. They did try to resist slavery, and they kind of did it in different ways, okay? So they did it in some sneakier ways. They would stage a work slowdown. So just everybody said, okay, we're going to slow down right now and just work very, very slowly. Or they would on purpose go through and break some tools, so they had to go fix them and could get less done. They would sneak off and burn buildings, or even to the point where they would maybe sometimes run away or attack their slaveholders. So those are kind of the more aggressive ones. And there were a few rebellions that came up and people that came through and tried to, the slaves tried to rise up and kind of free all slaves. In 1800, Gabriel Prosser was one of these people. His plan was to take Charleston and kill all of the pro-slave white people, so that didn't include Quakers and French people and a couple of different groups that they thought were anti-slave, but this was the plan. His plan was figured out before it was started, and all of the people involved in making this plan were executed. In 1822, Denmark Vesey was accused of planning a revolt. He was hanged. He was killed. We're not sure if he was actually planning a revolt or not. We are sure that Nat Turner was, because in 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion, he actually did carry out the attack, going through Virginia, freeing slaves as he went and killing all of the white people on each farm, and so he would get more people to come with him, and more weapons, and go to the next farm with more and attack and kill them. Ended up killing about 50 white people, men, women, and children, before he was caught by the militia. He was under the impression that God had chosen him to bring his people out of slavery. He was later executed for his involvement in this Turner's Rebellion. Take a moment to write 3 questions you have so far. If you don't have any questions, just make 3 test questions.